In the ancient world, before coins jingled in pockets and before gold or silver became the ultimate measure of wealth, communities depended on far subtler systems of exchange. Survival demanded cooperation, and cooperation was built not on minted money but on trust, obligation, and the goods that could sustain life. Imagine a world where the only way to secure your dinner was to trade the excess grain you had harvested for a clay pot, or to exchange a goat for the promise of protection. Every act of trade was not just economic, it was social, deeply personal, and often tied to honor and reputation. Barter was the foundation of daily transactions. A farmer with surplus wheat might exchange sacks of grain for tools forged by a local craftsman. A hunter who brought down a large animal might divide the meat, trading portions for pottery, hides, or shelter. The rhythm of life was driven by the movement of tangible goods, and the value of each item was fluid. Grain in a year of plenty was worth far less than a sack of salt in the middle of winter. Needs shifted constantly, and the worth of things was never universal. It depended on hunger, scarcity, and human relationships. But barter was not simply about the goods themselves, it was about the people who exchanged them. Trust was the invisible glue holding these transactions together. Without coins or contracts, a man's word was his bond, and his reputation was more valuable than gold. To cheat a neighbor, to fail to honor an agreement, could mean exclusion from the community or even death. In tightly knit tribes or villages, where everyone knew each other's face and family, betrayal was remembered for generations. Stories of dishonest tradesmen were passed on as warnings, ensuring that deceit rarely went unpunished. Proto-money did exist in some corners of the world, long before official currency. Cowrie shells glittered in the trade networks of Africa and Asia, prized both for their rarity and their beauty. In parts of Europe and the Near East, salt was so precious that it was traded like treasure, sometimes used as payment for soldiers or laborers. In pastoral societies, cattle themselves became a measure of wealth. A man's status could be judged by how many cows he owned, and marriages were often sealed with the transfer of livestock. These were not coins struck in metal, but they were units of value nonetheless, representing the earliest attempts to standardize worth. Still, what mattered most was not the shell or the salt, it was the system of obligations behind it. Ancient societies often relied on gift-giving economies, where one person offered goods or labor not in immediate expectation of return, but with the understanding that reciprocity would come later. A chieftain might host a lavish feast, slaughtering animals and distributing food freely, not as charity but as a statement of power. Those who ate were bound in loyalty to him, and in times of need, he could call upon them for service or tribute. In this way, generosity itself was a form of currency, one that bought influence, protection, and prestige. Consider the everyday exchanges that formed the lifeblood of small communities. A woman skilled in weaving baskets might give her work to a neighbor in exchange for medicinal herbs. A young man might help repair a thatched roof, knowing that when his own house needed fixing, others would come to his aid. These exchanges created webs of obligation so intricate that they were impossible to calculate in coins. What mattered was reciprocity, the unspoken promise that today's gift would become tomorrow's return. Yet, the system was far from perfect. Barter could create friction. What if a man needed grain but had only a chicken to offer, while the grain owner already had more poultry than he could manage? Negotiations could be tense, and trades could collapse. To resolve such disputes, many communities turned to elders, chiefs, or councils who acted as mediators. Their authority ensured fairness and reminded participants that the community itself was the guarantor of exchange. Out of these struggles, the seeds of organized economies and, eventually, currency were planted. Another hidden aspect of these invisible currencies was the role of marriage, alliances, and kinship. Dowries and bride prices were not paid in coins but in livestock, tools, or labor. Families cemented ties by exchanging daughters, resources, or obligations. In some cases, a marriage was less about romance and more about binding two groups into a web of mutual support. To refuse to honor these exchanges could spark feuds lasting decades, showing how deeply tied economics was to the social fabric. Debt also existed, though it looked different from what we know today. Instead of loans from banks, individuals owed one another favors, goods, or loyalty. If a hunter was too sick to join the hunt, his neighbors might feed his family, but this created a debt he was expected to repay later, perhaps through future hunts or by sharing whatever resources he could gather. These debts were not written on paper, they were written in memory, etched into the collective understanding of the community. Forgetting or denying such debts was nearly unthinkable, for it meant betraying not just a single person but the entire system that held the group together. Barter economies also created a world where value was subjective, almost psychological. What was a pot worth compared to a bundle of firewood? What was a cow worth compared to a promise of protection during war? These were not numbers, but judgments made in the moment, shaped by circumstance. The absence of fixed value made every exchange an act of negotiation, a test of trust, and a reinforcement of social bonds. In the end, life without money was not lawless chaos, nor was it a utopia of sharing. It was a delicate balance where survival depended on webs of trust, reciprocity, and obligation. Invisible currencies, honor, loyalty, reputation, were as powerful as any coin minted centuries later. To live in that world meant living constantly aware that every gift, every trade, every act of generosity or deceit echoed through the entire community. And it was in these fragile, trust-based systems that the very foundations of human economy were born. When imagining life in the ancient world without money or machines, it is tempting to picture constant innovation and discovery. Yet at its core, existence revolved around three simple but brutal necessities: food, water, and shelter. Every day was a battle to secure enough calories to live another sunrise, to find clean water that would not kill you, and to build a roof strong enough to keep out predators, storms, or biting cold. While today these things are taken for granted, in early human societies they were constant challenges, shaping the rhythm of life and the very structure of communities. Food was the most pressing concern. Hunting and gathering remained central long after small-scale agriculture emerged. For hunter-gatherers, survival depended on intimate knowledge of the land, which berries could be eaten, which roots could be dug in the lean months, when the herds migrated, and when fish swam upriver. Each wrong choice could be fatal. Some plants that looked edible carried poisons that could paralyze or kill. To avoid these dangers, communities passed down knowledge orally, sometimes wrapped in myth. "Do not eat the red fruit of this bush, for it belongs to the spirits," was another way of saying, "This will poison you." Survival was not only physical labor but a form of inherited wisdom. As humans settled into early agricultural communities, food became a matter of cycles and storage. Grain was a miracle crop, easy to grow, easy to dry, and able to last through seasons if kept from pests. Storage jars of clay, underground silos, and woven baskets sealed with pitch became lifelines. But even with these techniques, famine always lurked. A single bad harvest from drought, flood, or locusts could mean hunger for the entire year. In those desperate times, people turned to desperate measures, grinding bark into flour, boiling leather, even raiding neighboring groups to survive. The fragility of food supply made cooperation essential but also fueled conflict. Preservation of food was an art. Without refrigeration, ancient people relied on smoke, salt, drying, or burying foods in cool earth. Fish were strung up to dry in the sun, meat was smoked over slow fires, fruits were dried or turned into pastes. Salt, where available, was priceless, not just for flavor but for survival. To preserve food was to extend life through winter or drought, and the knowledge of these methods was guarded as carefully as weapons. Some societies even wove preservation into ritual, treating smokehouses or granaries as sacred spaces, watched over by deities or spirits. Water, though abundant in some regions, was far more dangerous than it appeared. Rivers and streams offered hydration, but they also carried parasites and disease. People learned to boil water when possible, though firewood itself could be scarce. Wells represented an enormous leap forward, but digging them was exhausting and dangerous labor. Where fresh water was rare, entire communities clustered around springs, lakes, or seasonal rivers, their survival tied to the fragile flow. Water rights became one of the earliest forms of conflict, leading to alliances or blood feuds depending on access. In arid regions, humans became astonishingly ingenious, carving irrigation channels, collecting dew, and storing rainwater in stone cisterns. To mismanage water was to invite disaster. Shelter was no less vital. Caves provided some of the earliest safe havens, but as populations grew and climates varied, humans built with what they had at hand: wood, reeds, animal hides, clay, and stone. In harsh winters, huts were lined with furs and heated by smoky fires. In deserts, shelters were woven from reeds, designed to allow breezes to flow through. Building was communal. One family could not raise a house alone. Neighbors lent hands, and in turn expected help when their own roofs collapsed or walls needed mending. This reciprocity was survival turned into architecture. But shelter was not only about warmth and protection. It was about identity. To build a home was to claim a piece of the earth. A hut or longhouse was not just a roof, it was a marker of belonging to a clan, a group, a lineage. Inside, hearths burned as centers of life, where families gathered to eat, tell stories, and survive long nights. Outside, walls defended not only against beasts but against rival humans. The fragile structures, whether mud brick walls in early villages or nomadic tents carried across grasslands, embodied both human vulnerability and resilience. Sanitation, often overlooked in the story of survival, was a hidden battle. Waste disposal had to be managed even without plumbing. Some societies dug pits far from living spaces, others used flowing rivers to carry waste away, sometimes poisoning their own water supplies in the process. Refuse heaps became breeding grounds for disease, yet also attracted scavengers that could be both a danger and a food source. The constant dance with filth shaped settlement patterns, forcing communities to adapt or perish. Archaeology reveals layers of waste just outside ancient dwellings, silent evidence of how survival was balanced against hygiene long before soap or sewage systems. The tension between feast and famine marked ancient life with a rhythm alien to the modern world. After a successful hunt or harvest, communities feasted, consuming enormous amounts of food in ritual or celebration, often because preservation was limited. In contrast, winters or droughts could bring gnawing hunger, with families surviving on thin gruel or scraps. These cycles shaped not only diet but worldview. Myths and rituals often revolved around fertility, abundance, and the fear of scarcity. Gods were prayed to not just for victory or love but for rain, for crops, for the survival of children. In all of this, survival was both brutal and beautiful. Every mouthful of food, every sip of clean water, every night spent in a sturdy shelter was won through relentless struggle and ingenuity. Ancient life had no guarantees, it was lived on the edge of hunger, thirst, and exposure. Yet from this precarious existence grew the foundations of human society: cooperation, innovation, ritual, and identity. Food, water, and shelter were never merely physical needs, they were the threads binding people together, teaching them to rely on one another, and forcing them to look ahead, plan, and hope. What seems today so basic, eating a meal, turning on a tap, locking a door, was once the hardest part of life. And it was precisely this daily struggle that forged communities capable of surviving centuries without the comforts of money or machines. In the modern age, machines are so deeply woven into the fabric of our lives that it is almost impossible to imagine existence without them. A cart transports our goods, a pulley lifts our burdens, a motor powers our tools. But in the ancient world, before wheels became common, before iron gears and cogs transformed labor, human survival depended almost entirely on muscle, fire, and an astonishing ability to improvise. Work was relentless, exhausting, and dangerous. Yet it was also in this crucible of sweat and strain that human ingenuity was born, where every task forced people to invent new ways to manipulate nature with the simplest of means. Without carts or wagons, the movement of heavy objects relied on collective strength and raw creativity. Enormous stones for monuments or houses were dragged across the earth using ropes of twisted fiber and logs rolled beneath them. Imagine dozens, even hundreds, of men and women hauling together, their bodies straining as chants and drums set the rhythm of their labor. A massive slab of rock might move only a few meters in a day. The process was slow and perilous, ropes snapped, logs splintered, and crushing accidents were common. Yet communities accepted these dangers because survival demanded it. To build a wall, a storage pit, or a communal hall was not luxury, it was defense against enemies and the elements. Even daily tasks required immense effort. Fetching water from a river meant walking miles while balancing jars on shoulders or hips. Gathering wood for fires meant hours spent cutting, dragging, and carrying heavy bundles back to camp. Farming was grueling. Without plows pulled by oxen, the soil was broken by hand with digging sticks or crude stone hoes. Each furrow carved into the ground represented hours of sweat. Work began with the sunrise and often ended only when the light failed, leaving bodies sore and broken long before old age. Yet the absence of machines did not mean the absence of technology. Fire, in particular, was the greatest machine of all. It transformed what human muscle alone could not. Fire softened metals, baked clay, and hardened wooden tools. It cooked food, making it more digestible and safer to eat. It lit the night, extended working hours, and kept predators at bay. Every task revolved around this force, so central and yet so dangerous. A poorly managed fire could consume homes and fields in minutes, erasing years of labor. Children grew up learning how to tend embers, how to feed flames with precision, and how to protect them from wind and rain. Fire was both life and death, a servant and a master. Consider the craft of pottery. Without potter's wheels, clay vessels were shaped by hand, built slowly with coils and smoothed into form. Hours of work went into a single pot, which was then fired in open pits or rudimentary kilns. The result was fragile yet revolutionary, containers for storing grain, carrying water, or cooking over flames. Each vessel represented not just labor but knowledge, passed down from one generation to the next. These handmade tools were the silent machines of ancient life, amplifying human ability without gears or wheels. Metalworking, too, was born out of muscle and fire. Smelting copper or tin required enormous amounts of wood to fuel hot fires, bellows made of animal hides to push air into flames, and careful handling of molten liquid. A single blade or tool might take days of labor to produce. Yet the reward was immense, a sharpened weapon that made hunting easier, or a sickle that allowed harvests to be cut more efficiently. These innovations slowly lessened the burden of human muscle, though they never replaced it entirely. Each tool was a multiplier of effort, but every strike of the hammer, every swing of the axe, still came from human arms. The cost of this lifestyle was written on the body. Bones unearthed from ancient burials tell the story of relentless toil, joints worn down from carrying loads, spines bent from years of bending over fields, fractures from accidents. Children were not spared from this labor. From a young age, they helped in gathering firewood, tending crops, herding animals, or hauling water. Old age was rare, not only because of disease but because bodies simply wore out. Yet despite this hardship, communities endured, driven by necessity and held together by shared labor. Work was also a form of social glue. Massive projects like raising a communal longhouse, digging irrigation ditches, or hauling stones for burial mounds required cooperation from dozens of people. These gatherings were both grueling and celebratory, turning backbreaking tasks into communal rituals. Songs, chants, and dances often accompanied work, creating rhythm and unity. The act of labor became part of identity, defining who belonged to the group and who did not. To refuse work was to risk exile, a fate worse than exhaustion. And yet, myths about ancient weakness collapse under scrutiny. Far from being fragile, early humans possessed strength and endurance that would put most modern bodies to shame. With no machines to rely on, every task built muscle, resilience, and toughness. Carrying loads that seem unthinkable today was simply routine. Even so, strength came at a cost: shorter lifespans, chronic pain, and a constant risk of injury. The ancient world was a place where survival meant burning through the body like a candle, using up its strength quickly in exchange for the continuation of the group. What emerges from this picture is not just hardship, but ingenuity. The absence of wheels, pulleys, and engines did not prevent people from building monuments, irrigating fields, or transporting heavy materials across impossible distances. They found ways to manipulate wood, stone, and fire, leveraging cooperation, rhythm, and determination. In a sense, their greatest machines were not tools but communities themselves, networks of people who pooled their muscle, shared their knowledge, and created something greater than any individual could manage alone. The story of ancient work is the story of human persistence. Every field tilled, every hut built, every jar fired in flames was a testament to the will to survive without the conveniences we now cannot imagine living without. Muscle, fire, and ingenuity were the true engines of that world, and they powered civilizations for thousands of years before the wheel or the machine would take their place. At first glance, the ancient world without money or machines might seem like a society of equals, small groups of people working side by side, sharing food, hunting together, and surviving as one. But beneath the surface, hierarchies were already forming, as ancient and as enduring as humanity itself. Even without coins to count wealth or machines to enforce authority, some individuals found ways to rise above others. Power was measured not in gold but in grain, not in palaces but in influence, not in machines but in control over people and resources. The simplest form of hierarchy began with leadership. In small bands, a leader often emerged from necessity: the best hunter, the strongest warrior, the wisest elder. His authority came not from written laws but from the trust, or the fear, of those around him. Over time, leadership hardened into the role of chiefs or headmen, whose voices carried weight in disputes, whose decisions determined whether to go to war or make peace. These leaders were not elected as in modern democracies, but chosen by reputation, charisma, or force. A skilled orator could sway an entire village, while a ruthless fighter could bend it through fear. Control of food was one of the earliest and most powerful forms of dominance. In agricultural settlements, those who managed granaries or food storage became central figures. To feed a hungry community was to command loyalty, to withhold grain was to wield terror. Famines often revealed these inequalities most starkly. When common families starved, elites still found ways to eat, protected by their stores and their followers. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of early storage pits and centralized granaries that suggest not everyone had equal access. Already, the seeds of inequality were rooted in the soil itself. Trade, too, created elites. In societies without money, long-distance exchange was risky and rare, and those who controlled it gained immense prestige. A chief who could acquire rare shells, amber, obsidian, or salt from distant lands elevated his status above others. These goods were not just practical, they carried symbolic power, becoming ornaments of authority or ritual. The possession of such items told a story: I can command connections, I can protect you, I can provide what others cannot. In this way, exotic objects became the jewelry of dominance, symbols of hidden hierarchies etched into necklaces and burial treasures. Religion provided another pathway to power. In many early societies, chiefs claimed their right to rule through divine favor, casting themselves as mediators between the world of humans and the realm of spirits or gods. Shamans, priests, or ritual leaders occupied positions of extraordinary authority, often equal to or greater than that of warriors. By declaring rituals necessary for harvests, rains, or victories in war, religious elites could control behavior, resources, and even lives. Sacrifices, whether of animals, goods, or people, were often demanded by these figures, reinforcing their control through fear of the unseen. Spiritual authority cloaked itself in mystery, but its effects were deeply material. The birth of inequality can also be traced in the very houses people built. In early villages, some dwellings were larger, fortified, or better supplied than others. Archaeologists often find differences in burials as well, some graves filled with pottery, ornaments, or weapons, while others hold only bones. These clues tell us that even in supposedly equal societies, wealth and status had already begun to separate people. While some slept in modest huts, others claimed central locations or more secure structures. Hierarchy was visible in architecture long before castles rose from stone. Slavery and servitude also emerged in these early systems. Without machines, labor was the most valuable resource, and the control of human bodies became a brutal form of wealth. Captives from raids, or those who fell into debt, could be forced into servitude, building structures, tending fields, or serving elites. They were the machines of the ancient world, exploited to ease the burdens of their masters. Though not always formalized as in later empires, this dynamic of forced labor left scars that echo throughout history. Justice itself was a weapon of hierarchy. With no written laws, punishments were decided by leaders, elders, or chiefs, often favoring those already powerful. A dispute between equals might be resolved fairly, but when a commoner opposed an elite, the outcome was rarely just. Brutal punishments, exile, mutilation, or even execution, reminded everyone of their place. These systems did not rely on police or prisons, they relied on spectacle, fear, and the knowledge that defying authority could mean social or literal death. Yet these hierarchies were not absolute tyrannies. In many communities, power had to be constantly maintained. A chief who failed to protect his people in war, or a shaman whose rituals failed to bring rain, could lose legitimacy quickly. Authority was fragile, built on constant performance and reinforcement. Leaders needed loyalty, and they often bought it through feasts, gifts, and protection. In this sense, generosity was as much a tool of rule as brutality. To host a great banquet, to slaughter livestock and feed an entire village, was not just hospitality, it was politics, binding others in loyalty through gratitude and obligation. These hidden hierarchies shaped the fabric of ancient societies in ways we still see today. The elites controlled food, trade, knowledge, and belief. They created systems of inequality that carved deep lines between common laborers and the powerful few. And though their authority may not have been written in coins or enforced by machines, it was no less real. The image of early life as simple and equal fades under the weight of these realities. Power was everywhere, etched into the distribution of food, embedded in rituals, carved into the walls of larger homes, and buried with the bones of those deemed greater than others. Even in the absence of wealth as we know it, humans found ways to elevate some and suppress others. The roots of kings and empires lay already in these small villages, in the hands of chiefs and priests who turned trust and survival into domination. Hierarchy was not a later corruption of society. It was there from the beginning, hidden in the shadows of survival, shaping the destiny of the ancient world long before coins or machines gave it new forms. If hunger shaped bodies and hierarchies shaped politics, then belief shaped the very soul of early societies. Long before organized religions with holy books and temples, humanity lived in a world where the boundaries between life, death, and the supernatural were thin. Every shadow might conceal a spirit, every illness might signal a curse, every storm might mean the anger of gods. These beliefs were not just abstract, they ruled daily life, guided choices, and justified the darkest of practices. Rituals became the language through which people tried to speak with the unseen. Without written prayers or established churches, ritual was a mix of performance, sacrifice, and symbol. Blood was at the center of many early practices. The spilling of animal blood on the earth was seen as feeding the gods or spirits, renewing cycles of fertility and growth. Hunters often performed rituals before and after a kill, offering parts of the animal to ensure future success. In some cultures, archaeologists have found traces suggesting that human blood, too, was sometimes considered the most powerful offering. Sacrificial pits filled with bones, burned remains, and symbolic carvings hint at these chilling realities. The dead themselves occupied a central role in belief systems. Ancestor worship was one of the earliest forms of religion, with graves treated as sacred spaces. Families buried loved ones under the floors of their homes, keeping them close as protectors, guardians, or even as sources of power. Some bodies were adorned with beads, pigments, or animal teeth, symbols that suggested a belief in continuity beyond death. Yet, this closeness to the dead also carried a dark side. Spirits were feared as much as they were honored, and rituals were performed to keep them appeased. Failure to do so might invite misfortune, sickness, or madness. Shamans and ritual leaders occupied mysterious roles in this world. Unlike chiefs who held visible authority, shamans dealt in unseen forces. They healed the sick with herbs and chants, guided communities through visions, and claimed the power to communicate with spirits. Their tools, animal bones, rattles, painted masks, were symbols of a bridge between the natural and supernatural. For many, the shaman was both healer and executioner, protector and manipulator. In times of crisis, their words could calm fears, or stoke them into frenzy. Rituals also gave structure to the chaos of life and death. Birth, puberty, marriage, and death were marked with symbolic acts. Some cultures scarred or tattooed their young, embedding the skin itself with sacred meaning. Others buried children with toys, or warriors with weapons, suggesting a belief that life continued in another realm. Even mundane acts like planting seeds could take ritual forms, with chants, dances, or symbolic offerings to ensure the earth would yield. In a world where survival was uncertain, ritual gave people a sense of control over forces they could not understand. Darkness lurked in these beliefs too. Fear of witchcraft, curses, and unseen enemies haunted many communities. An illness with no explanation might lead to accusations of sorcery, and suspected witches could face exile, punishment, or execution. Archaeological sites reveal skeletons buried face down or pinned with stones, suggesting a terror of the dead rising to harm the living. These were not myths written in books, they were daily fears, embodied in bones, scars, and soil. Some of the most disturbing rituals centered on fertility and agriculture. In a world dependent on harvests, the cycles of planting and reaping were sacred. Certain societies believed that blood spilled on the fields, whether animal or human, would feed the soil and guarantee crops. These sacrifices were often performed in public, turning ritual into spectacle, binding the community through shared fear and hope. The earth itself was imagined as a hungry being, demanding life in exchange for life. Masks and costumes added another dimension to ritual. When a shaman or priest donned the head of an animal or painted their body in ash and ochre, they ceased to be themselves. They became something else, a spirit, a god, a force of nature. These performances blurred the line between human and divine, terrifying audiences into obedience. Theatricality was power, and in early societies, the ability to embody mystery was as important as physical strength. What strikes modern minds as gruesome or bizarre made perfect sense to those living in a fragile world. Rituals were not merely superstition, they were survival strategies. They brought order to fear, offered explanations for misfortune, and gave meaning to suffering. Whether through sacrifice, ancestor worship, or shamanic visions, people found a way to make sense of their unpredictable lives. And yet, belief was never harmless. It justified violence, bound communities under fear, and demanded obedience to those who claimed spiritual authority. Rituals could unite, but they could also divide, branding some as chosen, others as cursed. In the absence of machines or science, belief became the strongest engine of control, running on terror, mystery, and hope. The ancient world was not only a place of hunger and hierarchy, it was a stage of blood and spirits, where every drop spilled, every chant sung, every grave dug carried weight beyond the physical. To live was to believe, and to believe was to bind oneself in a web of rituals, sacrifices, and unseen fears. When we imagine ancient life, we often think of strength, raw endurance, and people hardened by the elements. Yet the truth is far darker. Life was constantly threatened by sickness, injury, and the cruel unpredictability of the human body. Without machines, without medicine, and without the safety nets of modern infrastructure, survival was always a fragile negotiation between body, nature, and chance. The average lifespan was shockingly short, with many never living beyond their 20s or 30s. What strikes us today as simple, curable problems, an infected tooth, a broken bone, a difficult childbirth, were often death sentences in the ancient world. Illness was omnipresent. In crowded settlements, diseases spread quickly through contaminated water, spoiled food, and the close quarters of huts or caves. The knowledge of germs or bacteria did not exist. Instead, people turned to explanations rooted in spirits, curses, or the will of unseen gods. A fever was seen as possession, an infection as punishment, a seizure as a visitation from the divine. Remedies were often ritualistic, smoke blown over the sick, chants recited, herbs burned to chase away evil. Some treatments may have had real effects. Willow bark, for instance, contains compounds similar to aspirin, but more often, healing was a desperate gamble between trial and error. Injuries posed an equally grave threat. A fall, a cut from a stone tool, or a wound from hunting could quickly spiral into deadly infection. Archaeologists have found skeletons showing crude evidence of early surgeries, skulls with trepanation holes, bones that had been set after breaks. Some survived these procedures, their bones healing over time. Others did not. Imagine lying in a smoky hut, surrounded by family, as a stone knife was used to carve into your skull in hopes of curing a seizure or relieving pain. The courage, or desperation, that must have fueled such acts is almost unimaginable. Childbirth, too, was a dangerous frontier. Women bore the heaviest burden of mortality, with deaths in labor tragically common. Without medical knowledge or sterile tools, complications that are now easily treated, breech births, hemorrhage, infection, claimed countless lives. Infants themselves rarely survived beyond their first year, with estimates suggesting that in many communities, half of all children died before reaching adolescence. This grim reality shaped cultural practices. Some communities did not even name children until they had survived their early years, a haunting acknowledgement of the fragility of life. Nutrition played a vital role in health, yet diets were often inconsistent and harsh. Seasons dictated abundance or scarcity, and malnutrition left its mark on ancient bodies. Skeletal remains reveal stunted growth, brittle bones, and signs of chronic hunger. Teeth tell their own story, worn down from chewing tough grains, riddled with cavities, cracked from years of grinding. A simple abscessed tooth could spread infection into the bloodstream, causing death within days. To the people living then, it was not just disease or injury that threatened them, it was their very food, the foundation of survival. Mental health, though never recognized as we see it today, also weighed heavily on ancient lives. Stress from hunger, grief from loss, or trauma from violence would have been common. Yet such conditions were interpreted through spiritual or ritual lenses. A person suffering hallucinations or emotional withdrawal might be seen as touched by spirits, destined to be a shaman, or cursed by an enemy. In some cases, such individuals were revered, in others, they were feared, cast out, or sacrificed. The line between illness and holiness was thin, and it could determine one's fate in the community. The struggle for health extended to the environment itself. Parasites infested water sources, mosquitoes spread disease, and wild animals carried deadly infections. People lived in intimate contact with their surroundings, and every drink, every hunt, every shelter carried unseen dangers. Fire provided some protection, purifying food and scaring off predators, but it could not shield against the invisible threats of infection and disease. Despite the hardships, resilience shone through. Some skeletons show evidence of people who survived horrific injuries: a man who lived years after losing an arm, a woman who recovered from a shattered pelvis, children who healed from broken limbs. Such survival suggests strong communal care, where others ensured food, protection, and support. Health may have been fragile, but survival often depended on the bonds of family and tribe. The spiritual interpretation of sickness added another layer of complexity. Shamans and healers often dictated treatment, blending practical herbs with ritual performance. A plant might be boiled into a bitter drink, accompanied by chants to expel the sickness. A wound might be packed with moss or clay, substances that sometimes had antibacterial properties without the healer knowing why. These practices blurred the line between science and superstition, luck and knowledge. In many cases, recovery or death depended not just on the body's strength but on the interpretations of those trusted to heal. Ultimately, health in the ancient world was not a guarantee but a constant struggle. Life expectancy was short, survival precarious, and every day carried the shadow of illness or injury. The absence of machines and medicine forced people into a brutal intimacy with the body's limits. To live meant enduring pain, facing loss, and relying on fragile remedies against overwhelming odds. And yet, from this darkness emerged resilience, community, and the beginnings of medicine itself, a reminder that the human drive to heal, however imperfect, is as old as humanity itself. Though the ancient world lacked coins, markets, or machines to power ships and wagons, trade and exchange still thrived in surprising and ingenious ways. Survival demanded it. No single group of people could provide every resource they needed: stone for tools, salt for preservation, shells for decoration, hides for clothing, or pigments for rituals. This necessity gave rise to one of humanity's earliest and most fascinating networks, the web of trade, powered not by money but by barter, reputation, and trust. Barter was the foundation. Communities swapped what they had in surplus for what they lacked. A tribe near a river might trade fish or salt for stone tools from an inland group. Hunters might exchange hides for grain. These trades were not always equal in our sense of value. Instead, they were shaped by need, season, and relationships. Sometimes, the exchange was symbolic. A small shell bead could represent an agreement of peace and mutual obligation, carrying value beyond its physical worth. In this way, trade became not just economic but deeply social, a binding ritual between communities. Archaeological discoveries reveal astonishing distances across which goods traveled. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharpness, has been found hundreds of miles from its source. Amber from the Baltic appears in graves far to the south. Shells from coastal regions show up deep inland, carried not by carts or ships with sails but by networks of human hands and feet. Each object carried a story of journeys through forests, rivers, and mountains, passed from one group to another until it reached a final destination. These findings prove that even without money or machines, humanity was already building vast, silent trade routes that connected lands and cultures. Travel itself was perilous. Without maps or roads, paths were carved through memory, stars, and landmarks. Traders risked rivers, wild animals, and hostile encounters with other groups. A journey of exchange was not just physical but deeply symbolic, often accompanied by rituals for protection. Some communities painted themselves with protective pigments or carried amulets believed to ward off danger. Every step into unknown territory was a gamble, but the potential reward, salt, stone, or alliance, made the risk worthwhile. Salt, in particular, was one of the most coveted resources. Beyond flavor, it preserved meat, sustained life, and prevented sickness. Communities near salt deposits became vital hubs, their power tied not to armies or kings but to the crystals beneath their feet. Similarly, flint and obsidian became lifelines, sharper than bronze and crucial for tools and weapons. Possessing such materials meant survival, lacking them meant dependence on others. This need bound groups together in webs of obligation and exchange. Yet trade was not always peaceful. While many exchanges built alliances, others sparked envy, conflict, or theft. A traveling group burdened with goods was a tempting target. Some communities developed elaborate customs to ensure safety, such as rituals of gift-giving before trade began, or sacred spaces where violence was forbidden. Others relied on displays of strength, carrying weapons as warnings. Trade was never just economic, it was always political, always tied to power and reputation. Objects themselves carried symbolic weight. A necklace of beads might represent far more than decoration, it could mark identity, status, or alliance. To wear amber or obsidian was to signal connection to distant lands and powerful networks. These objects became silent markers of belonging, proof that one's community was part of something larger than itself. In a world without written language, goods became messages, speaking of journeys, promises, and power. Travel also brought knowledge. With goods came stories, techniques, and discoveries. A new way of shaping stone, a novel method of weaving fibers, a ritual from a distant tribe, these spread along trade routes as surely as beads and hides. In this way, human culture itself expanded, shaped not by isolated invention but by constant exchange. Ideas moved with goods, embedding themselves in new communities and transforming daily life. Seasonal gatherings amplified this process. Many groups traveled to common meeting places during certain times of the year, creating temporary hubs of trade, ritual, and alliance. These gatherings were more than markets, they were festivals of survival. Feasts were shared, marriages arranged, alliances sealed. Here, trade became inseparable from community life, shaping both economies and identities. Even without coins, even without machines, humanity built networks that stretched across landscapes and tied strangers together in fragile trust. The silent web of exchange was not written down, not planned in ledgers, yet it sustained life and laid the foundations for future civilizations. It taught people that survival depended not only on strength but also on connection, on the willingness to step into the unknown, to risk the journey, and to place faith in the fragile bonds of trade. The story of ancient exchange reminds us that humans have always sought connection beyond their immediate world. The absence of money did not mean isolation, instead, it fostered creativity, resilience, and systems of value that were as much about meaning as they were about survival. The silent journeys of obsidian, amber, and salt whisper across millennia, telling us that even in the harshest conditions, humanity was already weaving a web that bound us together. For all the ingenuity of barter, ritual, and survival strategies, the ancient world was never free from conflict. In fact, violence was one of its most enduring realities. Without courts, police, or centralized armies, disputes often escalated into bloodshed. Resources were scarce, alliances fragile, and fear constant. To live in these times meant not only to survive nature's indifference but also to survive the aggression of neighboring groups, raiding parties, and rival clans. Conflict often began with resources. A patch of fertile ground, a river rich with fish, or access to salt or stone could spark violence. In a world without abundance, every resource was worth fighting for. Disputes over hunting territories or water sources were common, and groups without secure access to these lifelines often resorted to raids. Archaeological evidence shows fortified settlements as early as the Neolithic, huts ringed by ditches, palisades, and walls of packed earth. These defenses were not ornamental, they were lifelines against sudden attack. Weapons themselves reveal the stark reality of violence. Stone-tipped spears, flint knives, and clubs were the tools of both hunting and war. Later, bows and arrows increased range and lethality, allowing raiders to strike quickly and vanish. Skulls found with arrowheads embedded in them, bones showing fractures from blunt weapons, and mass graves filled with men, women, and children all tell the same story: organized violence was part of daily life. Unlike the romantic image of solitary duels, ancient warfare was messy, communal, and brutal. Raiding became a survival strategy as much as farming or hunting. A successful raid could bring food, captives, or prestige. Raiding parties often targeted the vulnerable, travelers carrying goods, isolated huts, or settlements caught off guard. To be taken captive was a fate both feared and common. Captives might be enslaved, sacrificed, or absorbed into the conquering group. For some, raids were not just about resources but about asserting dominance, ensuring others lived in fear of their power. Violence was often ritualized, cloaked in the language of belief. Some groups treated warfare as sacred, offering sacrifices before battle or performing victory rituals afterward. Skulls of enemies were sometimes kept as trophies, displayed as warnings or incorporated into ceremonies. Such practices blurred the line between survival and spectacle, turning violence into both necessity and symbol. This fusion of war and ritual gave battles an intensity beyond strategy. They became performances of power and faith. The constant threat of violence shaped every aspect of life. Settlements were often built in defensible locations, on hills, near rivers, or surrounded by ditches. Families slept lightly, aware that night raids could come without warning. Tools doubled as weapons, and every able-bodied adult was expected to defend their community. Children grew up in an environment where violence was not exceptional but ordinary, a fact of life as real as hunger or sickness. Even within groups, violence was a reality. Disputes over leadership, betrayal, or resources could turn deadly. Without written laws or established systems of justice, vengeance often became the rule. Feuds between families or clans could last generations, each act of violence answered by another. This cycle of retaliation created an atmosphere where peace was always temporary, fragile, and conditional. Yet, in the midst of brutality, cooperation persisted. Alliances formed not only through trade and marriage but also through shared defense. Neighboring groups sometimes united against common enemies, creating fragile coalitions. These alliances, however, were always at risk of breaking. A single betrayal or resource shortage could unravel trust, turning allies into enemies overnight. Survival meant navigating this shifting landscape of fear, friendship, and hostility. Mass graves provide haunting evidence of ancient massacres. Entire villages wiped out, bodies buried hastily, women and children among the dead. These are not tales of grand armies but of small-scale wars, brutal and intimate. Every spear thrust, every arrow fired was up close, personal, and raw. Unlike modern warfare, which distances killers through machines, ancient violence was face-to-face, its consequences seen and felt in real time. But violence also drove innovation. The need to defend and attack spurred the creation of stronger weapons, sturdier shelters, and better tactics. Warfare, as much as farming or ritual, shaped the evolution of human society. The constant threat forced groups to adapt, to unite, and to imagine new ways of surviving against one another. The ancient world was not a paradise of peace or noble simplicity. It was a landscape scarred by conflict, where raids were as common as rituals and where every dawn could bring danger. For those who lived then, violence was not an interruption of life, it was part of the rhythm of existence. To be human in the ancient world was to live under the shadow of war, to know that survival depended not only on food and faith but on the ability to fight, defend, and endure. Amidst the hunger, rituals, and violence of the ancient world, life was not only about survival but also about continuity. Children were born into uncertainty, and elders carried the fragile weight of memory. Between these two ends of life stretched the rhythm of daily existence, a cycle of work, play, teaching, and loss that defined communities across generations. It was in this cycle, not just in wars or rituals, that the true texture of ancient humanity is revealed. Children entered the world into danger. Infant mortality was staggering, many did not live beyond their first year. Those who survived were often regarded as both blessings and burdens. They were blessings because they carried the promise of survival, the continuation of family and tribe. They were burdens because they demanded constant care in a world where food and energy were scarce. Mothers nursed while still working, carrying infants on their backs during hunts for berries or labor in the fields. Childhood was brief. As soon as children could walk, they were integrated into the work of survival. Play did exist, but it was often intertwined with training. Small figurines carved from bone, balls made of leather, and simple games of throwing stones or racing prepared children for adult tasks. Boys imitated hunters with miniature weapons, while girls practiced weaving grasses or tending small fires. Even games had survival written into them, a subtle form of education disguised as leisure. The line between childhood and adulthood was thin. A child of 8 or 9 might already join hunts, care for siblings, or help defend the community. Teaching was oral and embodied. Without writing, knowledge was passed down through stories, songs, and demonstrations. Elders played a critical role here. They were the libraries of the ancient world, carrying within their memories the lessons of countless seasons: when to plant, where to hunt, how to cure sickness, what rituals to perform. A song might contain the memory of a migration route. A story told by firelight might carry warnings about poison plants or treacherous rivers. Elders taught not with books but with presence, their words woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet old age was a rare achievement. Many did not survive long enough to become elders. Those who did were both revered and burdened. Revered, because they carried wisdom and authority, often consulted in decisions of survival and ritual. Burdened, because they were fragile in a world that demanded strength. A broken hip or failing sight could mean dependence on others. Some communities cared for their elders, ensuring food and protection even when they could no longer contribute. Others, faced with harsh scarcity, abandoned the old or left them behind during migrations. Archaeological evidence suggests both tenderness and cruelty: skeletons of the elderly who lived with years of disability, cared for by others, and graves where the aged were buried hastily, as if cast off. Family structures revolved around survival. Kinship was not just emotional, it was strategic. Every child added hands for labor, every elder added knowledge, every extended relative added security. Families were not nuclear but extended, with cousins, uncles, and grandparents forming webs of obligation. Marriage itself was often less about romance than about alliance, binding families or groups together for mutual support. Women might move between groups, carrying with them not only labor but also the fragile threads of peace between clans. Death, inevitable and omnipresent, shaped these cycles. Children buried with beads or toys, elders interred with tools or symbols of memory, reveal how communities honored the stages of life. Death rituals gave meaning to loss, weaving the end of one cycle into the continuity of the next. Sometimes the dead were placed under floors or near hearths, as if to remain part of daily life even after passing. Other times they were carried to sacred spaces, their burial a community act of both grief and survival. Despite the harshness, there was tenderness. A child's skeleton found carefully wrapped in animal hide, a grave where a woman was buried holding an infant, or signs of long care for disabled elders, all suggest that love and care existed alongside brutality. Survival may have been the central demand, but humanity's emotional depth persisted, even when it seemed impractical. These small acts of compassion are what make the ancient world both terrifying and profoundly human. The cycles of everyday life, birth, childhood, work, old age, death, were the quiet backdrop to the dramas of war and ritual. They remind us that for every shaman's chant or warrior's raid, there were countless moments of small labor, children gathering sticks, mothers cooking roots, elders telling stories by fading firelight. The extraordinary may dominate the archaeological record, but it was the ordinary that sustained humanity. To live in the ancient world was to move constantly through cycles of fragility and resilience. Children carried the hope of tomorrow, elders guarded the memory of yesterday, and between them stretched a present of constant work. In these rhythms, the true essence of humanity can be seen, not in monuments or machines, but in the fragile continuity of life itself. If hunger, ritual, and violence reveal the struggles of ancient survival, then art and symbols reveal the spark that made humanity more than just another animal. Long before machines, coins, or written language, people carved, painted, and sang. They left marks on stone, bones, and caves that had no obvious survival function but carried something deeper, meaning. These early expressions were not luxuries, they were tools of memory, power, and imagination, shaping how people understood themselves and their world. The caves of Europe, Africa, and Asia tell one of the earliest chapters of this story. Deep underground, away from sunlight, ancient hands painted bison, deer, and horses in ochre, charcoal, and crushed minerals. The precision is astonishing, animals in motion, hunters with spears, hands outlined in negative print as if to declare, "I was here." These were not idle doodles. Many of the animals depicted were those most critical for food, ritual, or survival. Some scholars believe these paintings were forms of magic, attempts to ensure success in the hunt by capturing the animal's spirit on stone. Others see them as early storytelling, visual records of the struggles and triumphs of daily life. Whatever their purpose, they reveal a mind capable of abstraction, a leap beyond mere survival into the realm of imagination. Portable art also flourished. Small figurines carved from bone, ivory, or clay, often of human forms, sometimes exaggerated, appear across ancient sites. The so-called Venus figurines, with their rounded bodies and emphasis on fertility, suggest deep symbolic meaning. Were they charms for childbirth, representations of a mother goddess, or symbols of abundance? We cannot know for certain, but their ubiquity reveals how central symbolism was to human thought. Even in scarcity, people devoted time and effort to carving meaning into objects. Symbols extended beyond art into adornment. Beads made of shells, animal teeth, and carved stones were strung into necklaces, worn as bracelets, or sewn into clothing. These were not just decorative, they marked identity, status, and belonging. To wear a bead from a distant land was to signal connection to a wider world, to carry proof of trade, alliance, or ancestry. Adornment turned the body into a canvas of meaning, declaring not just who a person was, but who they were connected to. Music and sound carried their own symbolic weight. Flutes made from bird bones and drums fashioned from stretched hides appear in the archaeological record, suggesting that rhythm and song were woven into ancient life. Music may have been used in rituals, to accompany dances, or to create unity during communal work. Imagine a group chanting as they grind grain, or drumming as they prepare for a hunt, or singing as they bury their dead. These sounds carried memory, emotion, and power, binding communities together in ways as vital as tools or weapons. Art also functioned as an early form of memory storage. In a world without writing, symbols could preserve knowledge. Carved marks on bones and stones, lines, dots, and patterns, may have recorded lunar cycles, seasons, or counts of animals. These were the beginnings of data, primitive yet powerful, encoding survival knowledge into physical form. From such marks would eventually grow writing, calendars, and history itself. But even in their simplest form, they show that humans were already reaching beyond the present moment, trying to hold on to time. Yet, just as with rituals, art had a darker side. It could enforce power and hierarchy. Shamans and leaders often controlled symbols, declaring their meaning. A mask might not just frighten, it might cement the authority of the wearer. A carving might not just decorate, it might declare ownership, lineage, or dominance. In this way, art was never neutral, it carried weight, shaping how people thought, feared, and obeyed. The act of creating art also reveals a unique courage. In times of hunger and danger, to spend hours painting in a cave or carving a figurine might seem wasteful. Yet humans did it anyway. This willingness to invest energy in imagination reveals that survival was never just about the body. It was also about the mind, about the need to find meaning beyond daily struggle. Perhaps art was a form of resilience, a way of asserting humanity against the indifference of nature. Symbols bridged the gap between the visible and the invisible. They allowed communities to express beliefs that could not be spoken plainly, to share identity without words, to connect the living with the dead. Each painted animal, each carved figurine, each bead worn into the grave was a statement that life was more than hunger, that existence carried patterns worth remembering, and that humans were not merely surviving but imagining. The birth of art and symbols marks one of the greatest transformations in human history. It was the moment when survival was no longer enough, when humans demanded meaning, beauty, and permanence. In the flicker of torchlight on a cave wall, in the soft sound of a bone flute, we see the emergence of imagination, the same imagination that would one day build temples, write epics, and shape civilizations. Without money or machines, humans created the first currency of all, meaning. When we imagine the ancient world without money or machines, it is easy to picture isolated villages, each struggling to survive on its own. But this image is deceptive. Beneath the surface of daily life, long before coins or carts rolled across empires, humans built vast networks of exchange. Goods, ideas, and symbols moved silently across rivers, deserts, and mountain passes, carried not by merchants in bustling markets but by ordinary people, hunters, travelers, and wanderers, who turned the world into an interconnected web. At first glance, these exchanges seem simple, a tribe near the coast gathering shells, then carrying them inland to trade with forest dwellers for flint or obsidian. But beneath these small acts lies something astonishing, the beginnings of global connection. Archaeologists have uncovered seashells in caves hundreds of miles from any ocean, beads carved from exotic stones found far from their source, and pigments from distant quarries decorating caves far from their origin. These discoveries tell us that even without money, humans had value systems, that objects carried significance beyond their immediate use, and that people were willing to travel or negotiate to obtain them. Stone was among the first goods to create long-distance trade. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edges, appears in toolkits thousands of miles from the nearest volcanic site. To carry obsidian from Anatolia into the Balkans or from Central America into distant valleys required not just movement, but trust. Each handoff, from tribe to tribe, was a silent agreement that value existed in the stone, and that exchanging it brought mutual benefit. This was commerce without currency, a chain of human relationships stretching across vast distances. Salt, too, shaped these networks. Essential for preserving food and sustaining life, salt deposits became hubs of activity. Communities near salt springs or lakes often rose to prominence, not because of armies or kings, but because they controlled access to a resource as vital as air. The paths people carved to reach these sites became the earliest highways of exchange, foot trails trodden by countless generations. Even today, traces of these ancient salt routes remain visible in Europe, Africa, and Asia, reminders of a world where survival depended on silent trade. But it was not only raw materials that traveled. Ideas moved with equal force. A flint knapping technique perfected in one valley spread across entire continents. Ritual objects, carved in one region, inspired imitations elsewhere. Even myths and symbols may have spread this way, a certain design on pottery, a recurring shape in carvings, or a shared burial practice across distant lands hint at cultural connections far deeper than mere trade. The exchange of goods was always entwined with the exchange of meaning. Hidden within these networks were also the first inklings of inequality. To control a resource, obsidian, salt, shells, or pigments, was to hold power. Leaders and shamans often became gatekeepers, deciding who received what. In this way, early trade was not purely cooperative. It could be exploited, manipulated, and used to enforce hierarchy. The one who had access to distant goods could claim spiritual authority, presenting shells or stones as gifts from the gods, when in fact they were the results of human exchange. Thus, even in its earliest form, trade was tied to power and illusion. The routes themselves became more than physical paths, they were social threads, weaving communities together. Along rivers, groups camped, shared stories, and exchanged not just goods but marriages, alliances, and friendships. A necklace of shells might symbolize not only beauty but a bond between groups. A tool of obsidian might not only cut but remind its owner of a partnership formed far away. In this way, objects carried with them invisible histories, whispers of hands long past, journeys long traveled. Travel was dangerous, of course. Without wheels or beasts of burden in many regions, goods moved on human backs or in woven baskets carried for days across rugged terrain. Travelers faced hunger, storms, predators, and the risk of hostility from unknown tribes. And yet they went, compelled not by money but by the pull of necessity and meaning. The rewards, salt to preserve meat, stone to fashion tools, beads to adorn the dead, were worth the danger. Each journey etched new trails into the landscape, gradually shaping the silent highways that connected the ancient world. Over time, these networks set the stage for the great civilizations to come. The exchange of stone, salt, shells, and ideas laid the foundation for later trade in bronze, gold, spices, and silk. But in their origins, these were humble, hidden connections, invisible to the eye yet powerful in their reach. A bead buried in a grave, a shard of obsidian in a toolkit, a streak of foreign pigment on a cave wall, these were the markers of humanity's first economy, one built not on coins or machines but on trust, exchange, and shared survival. The silent highways of ancient trade remind us that even in the harshest conditions, humans sought connection. Isolation was never the rule, interaction was. Without money, without wheels, without maps, they still linked themselves together, tribe to tribe, valley to valley, continent to continent. These networks were the veins of early humanity, pulsing with goods, ideas, and meaning, keeping the body of the ancient world alive. As we near the end of this journey into the distant past, we stand at the threshold where scattered bands of foragers, ritual makers, and early traders began to transform into the first settled communities that would one day call themselves civilizations. The story of life without money or machines is not merely a chronicle of scarcity and hardship. It is also the story of ingenuity, resilience, and the stubborn refusal of humans to remain bound by the limitations of nature. This final reflection allows us to see the larger picture, the lessons hidden in a world so unlike our own, yet one that still whispers in the rhythms of modern life. At its core, survival in the ancient world was a relentless balancing act. Hunger, predators, disease, and uncertainty defined the daily experience. Yet within this crucible of difficulty, humans learned the skills that would later sustain cities and kingdoms. The grinding of grain, the storing of food, the shaping of tools, and the sharing of labor were not primitive acts but the building blocks of civilization. Without them, the monumental temples of Sumer or the pyramids of Egypt could never have risen. What appears today as fragile, humble beginnings were in truth the foundation stones of our entire world. One of the most striking lessons lies in cooperation. Without machines to amplify power or coins to mediate trust, everything depended on people themselves. A hunt could not succeed without coordinated effort. A community could not endure famine without sharing. A ritual could not bind a people without collective belief. In this sense, the absence of money or machines forced a reliance on human bonds. Kinship, story, and obligation became the glue that held early societies together. In a way, these social currencies were stronger than coins ever could be, for they were rooted not in metal but in memory. But this world was also deeply unequal. Gender roles often fell into strict divisions, men hunting or fighting, women gathering, grinding, or nurturing. Power was concentrated in those who could interpret symbols or control access to scarce resources. Rituals often reinforced authority rather than challenging it. Even without formal states, hierarchy crept in through the back door of belief and exchange. The seeds of inequality that still haunt us today were planted not in palaces but in firelit circles around early hearths. This darker truth reminds us that civilization was not a clean break from the wild but an extension of patterns already forming in prehistory. Trade networks, as we saw, stretched far and wide, binding distant groups together. But these exchanges were not just economic, they were civilizational rehearsals. To carry shells inland or obsidian outward was to knit together the first threads of global connectivity. Each trade was a quiet step toward the idea of interdependence. When money and machines eventually arrived, they merely accelerated processes already underway. The foundation had been laid long before, in the silent highways carved by bare feet and the invisible trust woven by strangers meeting at riverbanks. Art and ritual, too, played civilizational roles. What began as painted caves and carved figurines became, over generations, temples and mythologies. The desire to represent, to remember, and to imagine grew until it birthed writing, law, and history itself. The same impulse that led a shaman to paint a bison in ochre inspired later scribes to record kings' conquests on clay tablets. The imagination of the ancient world was not an ornament, it was the engine of human progress. Looking back, what shocks us most is not how different life was but how familiar it feels in its essence. The struggles for food, security, meaning, and connection have never disappeared. We, too, build rituals, though ours take the form of national holidays or daily routines. We, too, trade symbols, though ours are digital, floating through invisible networks. We, too, mark status with adornment, though our shells are now brands, and our beads are luxury goods. Strip away money and machines, and the human patterns remain, to gather, to exchange, to believe, and to tell stories. Yet there is also a sobering lesson. In the ancient world, survival hinged on balance with nature. Take too much from a hunting ground, and it would fail. Neglect cooperation, and the group would starve. Ignore the rhythms of seasons, and disaster would follow. In our machine-powered, money-driven age, we often forget this balance. But the echoes of prehistory remind us that technology does not free us from dependence, it only masks it. The lessons of scarcity and interconnection remain as vital now as they were in the caves of our ancestors. The transformation from survival to civilization was not sudden. It was the slow accumulation of countless small acts, the grinding of a seed into flour, the carving of a bead, the sharing of meat, the telling of a story. Each was insignificant on its own, but together they built the scaffolding of human society. Without coins or machines, humans still managed to create bonds, hierarchies, art, and memory, everything needed for civilization to eventually emerge. And so, the story of life without money or machines is not merely a tale of deprivation. It is a reminder of what humans are capable of when stripped to their essentials. It shows us that survival requires imagination, that community is a form of wealth, and that meaning is the oldest currency of all. From the flicker of firelight to the roar of engines, the thread has never been broken. We are still the descendants of those who painted in caves, traded shells, and buried their dead with care. Civilization is not a separate story, it is the continuation of theirs. As we close this journey, we realize that the past is not as distant as it seems. The people of the ancient world lived without money or machines, yet they created the foundations of everything we now call modern. Their hidden struggles and triumphs still shape us, their voices still echo in our myths, and their lessons still wait in the stones, bones, and silent highways of time.